Annie Martinez hadn't planned on being a hero that day. As an urban photographer documenting abandoned buildings in Detroit's forgotten neighborhoods, she'd seen her share of heartbreaking scenes. But nothing had prepared her for what she found in the basement of the old Carson house on Maple Street. The first sign was the smell, a mix of decay and something else she couldn't identify. Her flashlight beam caught something moving in the corner, so slight it could have been a shadow. Then she heard it, a breath so weak it was barely audible, followed by the lightest scraping of nails on concrete. In the beam of her flashlight, the shape slowly materialized. A German shepherd lay curled in the corner, his body so emaciated that every rib was visible through his dull, patchy fur. His eyes, sunken deep into his skull, reflected the light with a ghostly blue-green tinge, a sign of severe dehydration. A heavy chain ran from his neck to a support beam, its weight almost equal to what remained of his body mass. "Oh my God," Annie whispered, her camera dropping to her side. The dog's head lifted slightly at her voice, a movement that seemed to cost him his last reserves of energy. His tongue, cracked and swollen from dehydration, tried to moisten his lips but couldn't. Even from several feet away, Annie could see his pulse fluttering erratically in his neck, his body struggling to maintain basic functions. Training her flashlight around the basement, the story became clear. Empty food bags and water bowls covered in dust showed that someone had once cared for him here. But the thick layer of cobwebs over everything suggested it had been weeks, maybe months, since anyone had checked on him. The concrete floor around him was scratched deeply with desperate marks, showing how he'd fought against his chain until he no longer had the strength. Annie's hand shook as she called emergency animal services. "I need help immediately," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I found a German shepherd. He's been chained in a basement, severely emaciated. He's barely breathing." She looked at the dog again, her throat tightening. "Please, hurry. I don't think he has much time." While waiting for help, Annie slowly approached the shepherd. His eyes tracked her movement, but he made no attempt to move, either in fear or aggression. He simply had no energy left. Up close, his condition was even worse. His muscles had begun to break down, his body consuming itself in a desperate attempt to stay alive. The chain around his neck had rubbed his skin raw, the wounds now infected. "I'm here," she whispered, kneeling near him but not too close. "Help is coming. Just hold on." The dog's tail moved slightly, the smallest thump against the concrete. Even in his desperate state, he was trying to respond to kindness. Annie had to turn away to wipe her eyes, the simple gesture breaking her heart. Emergency responders arrived within 15 minutes, but each second felt like an eternity. Dr. Rachel Wong, the on-call veterinarian, took one look at the shepherd and immediately began setting up an IV line. "His organs are shutting down," she explained as she worked. "He's in critical shock. We need to get fluids into him before we even think about moving him." The process of removing his chain took excruciating care. Years of rust had fused some links together, and the dog's skin had grown around others. He remained eerily still during the procedure, his only movement the shallow rise and fall of his chest. His body temperature was so low it barely registered on the thermometer. "Heart rate is dangerously irregular," Dr. Wong reported as they prepared him for transport. "Severe muscle wasting, probable organ failure, extreme dehydration. He's going to need intensive care if he survives the next hour." She looked at Annie. "Do you know his name? Any history?" Annie shook her head, but as they carefully lifted him onto the stretcher, she noticed something. Despite his emaciated state, despite the horror he'd endured, there was still a dignity in how he held his head, a nobility that his suffering couldn't erase. "Titan," she said suddenly. "His name is Titan." The emergency team worked quickly to stabilize him for transport. 2 IV lines were running wide open, pushing fluids into his depleted system. A warming blanket was wrapped around his skeletal frame, trying to raise his dangerously low body temperature. His breathing was becoming more labored. a sign that his body was struggling to handle even the basic medical intervention. As they carried him up the basement stairs, Titan's eyes never left Annie's face. There was something in that gaze that went beyond physical suffering. A question, perhaps, or a plea. Without thinking about it, Annie found herself following the stretcher to the emergency vehicle. When Dr. Wong raised an eyebrow, Annie simply said, "I'm coming with him." The ride to the emergency veterinary hospital was tense. Titan's condition deteriorated twice, requiring immediate intervention. His body, starved for so long, was struggling to process the fluids meant to save him. Each bump in the road seemed to cause him pain, though he made no sound. Annie sat next to him, speaking softly, watching the life-and-death battle playing out on the monitor screens. Looking at his paws, Annie noticed they were worn raw from trying to escape his chain. Even his nails were broken and bleeding from scratching at the concrete. Yet there was something about the shape of his muzzle, the set of his ears, that suggested he had once been a magnificent example of his breed. Someone had loved him once, before abandoning him to this basement prison. The emergency room at Detroit Veterinary Specialists erupted into controlled chaos as Titan was rushed through the doors. Dr. Wong's preliminary call had mobilized the hospital's critical care team, and they descended on the dying shepherd with practiced efficiency. The initial readings were devastating. Temperature 94.6, barely registering blood pressure, severe bradycardia, and blood sugar levels so low they were almost incompatible with life. "Start him on a dextrose drip," ordered Dr. James Chen, the hospital's senior critical care specialist. "Push warm fluids and start blood work. We need to know how much organ damage we're dealing with." His experienced eyes took in Titan's condition with professional detachment, but the slight tightening of his jaw betrayed his emotional response to the shepherd's state. Annie stood pressed against the wall, watching the medical team work. They had allowed her to stay only after she promised not to interfere. Through the forest of arms and medical equipment, she could see Titan's face. His eyes remained open, tracking movement around him with an awareness that seemed impossible given his condition. The first blood results painted a grim picture. "Kidney values are through the roof," reported Dr. Wong, scanning the numbers. "Liver enzymes critically elevated. We're seeing muscle breakdown products that could cause heart failure." She looked at Dr. Chen. "Do we continue?" The question hung in the air. They both knew the cost of intensive care would be astronomical, with no guarantee of success. Before Dr. Chen could respond, Titan made a sound. Not quite a whimper, but a soft exhale that somehow carried both pain and determination. His tail moved weakly against the table. The entire team paused, watching as the shepherd struggled to lift his head, his eyes seeking out Annie across the room. In that moment, the decision was made. "Start continuous renal replacement therapy," Dr. Chen ordered. "We need to support his kidneys while his body stabilizes. Begin plasma transfusions for the liver support. If he's fighting this hard, we're fighting with him." The team moved with renewed purpose, each member understanding they were witnessing something extraordinary. The next few hours became a careful ballet of medical intervention. Each treatment had to be precisely balanced. Too much too quickly could shock his system. Too little wouldn't save him. They warmed his body slowly, degree by degree, while monitoring his heart's response. The first plasma transfusion triggered a dangerous reaction, requiring immediate medication and adjustment of the protocol. Annie remained through it all, sometimes stepping out when procedures required sterility, but always returning to her post by the wall. She hadn't planned on spending her day in an emergency vet clinic, but something about Titan's spirit had grabbed hold of her heart. She watched as bags of fluids emptied into his veins, as monitors beeped with various alarms, as the medical team fought minute by minute to stabilize him. Hour 4 brought the first crisis. Titan's heart rhythm suddenly became erratic, his body struggling to manage the electrolyte shifts caused by refeeding syndrome. The team moved instantly, adjusting medications and supporting his cardiac function. Through it all, Titan remained impossibly calm, as if he understood they were trying to help him. "His blood work is starting to show some improvement," Dr. Wong reported at hour 6. "Kidney values are still critical, but they're trending in the right direction. The biggest concern now is his liver. We're not seeing the response we'd hoped for from the plasma therapy." She gently stroked Titan's head, a gesture that would have been risky with most critically ill dogs but seemed natural with him. The next challenge came when they attempted to clean his wounds. Years of the chain's friction had created deep tissue damage around his neck, much of it infected. Even with pain medication, the process of debriding the dead tissue was excruciating. Titan endured it stoically, only the slight trembling of his body betraying his discomfort. Hour 8 brought a moment of hope. Titan's blood pressure stabilized enough to reduce some of his medications. His temperature had risen to nearly normal, and his blood sugar levels were maintaining without constant dextrose supplementation. But just as the team began to feel cautiously optimistic, his oxygen levels started dropping. "Pulmonary edema," Dr. Chen diagnosed, listening to Titan's chest. "His heart isn't strong enough to handle the fluid therapy he needs." The team quickly adjusted, adding diuretics and respiratory support. Titan's breathing became increasingly labored, each breath a visible struggle. Annie found herself holding her breath with him, willing him to keep fighting. The night shift arrived, bringing fresh energy to the battle for Titan's life. Dr. Chen stayed past his shift, unwilling to leave at such a critical point. The new blood work showed small improvements in some areas but concerning deterioration in others. They were walking a tightrope, every treatment a careful balance between helping and potentially harming. Annie used her phone to document Titan's condition, photographing him with the team's permission. Something told her his story needed to be shared, needed to be witnessed. Between the forest of 4 lines and monitoring equipment, she captured his eyes. Still alert, still fighting, still somehow maintaining that spark of dignity that had struck her in the basement. Hour 12 brought another crisis. Titan's temperature suddenly spiked, his body mounting an inflammatory response to the infection in his wounds. The team worked quickly to control the fever while maintaining the delicate balance of his other treatments. Through it all, Titan's eyes remained fixed on Annie, as if drawing strength from her presence. "Most dogs in his condition wouldn't have survived the first hour," Dr. Chen told Annie quietly during a rare, quiet moment. "There's something special about him, but the next 12 hours will be crucial. His body is so depleted, so damaged, we're asking it to fight multiple battles at once." He paused, watching Titan's chest rise and fall. The fact that he's made it this far is nothing short of miraculous. The first 48 hours after Titan's rescue became a milestone that the veterinary staff would talk about for years to come. Each small victory was celebrated. The first time his blood work showed normal kidney values, the moment he lifted his head on his own, the first tail wag that wasn't prompted by pain or confusion. But it was on the morning of the 3rd day that Titan truly showed his will to live. Dr. Wong arrived for her morning rounds to find Titan attempting to sit up in his bed. His body trembled with the effort, 4 lines tangling as he moved, but his determination was clear. The monitor alarms had brought nurses running, only to stop and watch in amazement as the shepherd who had been at death's door fought to show them he wasn't finished yet. The challenge of refeeding a severely starved dog required extreme caution. Too much food too quickly could be fatal, but Titan's body desperately needed nutrition to heal. They started with tiny amounts of a special liquid diet, administered through a feeding tube. The first feeding was nerve-wracking. The team watched the monitors closely, ready to intervene if his body rejected the nourishment. Annie had returned home briefly to shower and change, but found herself drawn back to the clinic. She arrived to find Titan's eyes tracking her movement the moment she entered his room. The feeding tube had been uncomfortable for him, but he hadn't fought it. Now, seeing Annie, he made a valiant attempt to wag his tail, the movement barely visible but unmistakable. Physical therapy began with the smallest of movements. Lisa, the rehabilitation specialist, started with gentle, passive motion exercises, helping Titan's wasted muscles remember how to work. His body was like a map of his suffering. Certain muscles had atrophied more than others, showing how he had strained against his chain, how he had tried to reach for food or water that was just out of reach. The first major breakthrough came during a therapy session when Lisa brought out a small piece of boiled chicken. Titan's nose twitched, the first sign of interest in food he had shown. Though still receiving most of his nutrition through the feeding tube, he made a heroic effort to lift his head toward the treat. The entire team watched, holding their breath as he carefully accepted the morsel from Lisa's hand. "He's not just surviving now," Dr. Chen observed, watching Titan's therapy. "He's starting to live again." The shepherd's blood work was stabilizing, his wounds were healing, and most importantly, his eyes had lost that desperate gleam of survival and were showing interest in the world around him. Staff members began taking turns sitting with him during their breaks, reading or talking softly, helping him remember that human contact didn't have to mean pain. Annie's photographs of Titan's journey had started gaining attention on social media. Her initial post about his rescue had gone viral, touching hearts across the country. Donations poured in to cover his mounting medical bills, and offers to adopt him arrived from as far away as California. But Annie found herself reluctant to think about Titan's future home. Somehow, during those long hours in the emergency room, he had already claimed a piece of her heart. The first time Titan managed to stand on his own became a celebrated event at the clinic. It lasted only seconds, his legs trembling violently with the effort, but the achievement represented hundreds of hours of therapy and care. The staff gathered to watch, many with tears in their eyes, as Titan fought against gravity and his own weakness to prove that he could do it. Each day brought new challenges and victories. The feeding tube was removed as Titan began eating small meals on his own. His fur, which had been patchy and dull, began to show signs of new growth. The wounds around his neck healed, leaving scars that would always tell his story but no longer caused him pain. Most remarkably, despite everything humans had done to him, he showed no signs of aggression or fear. 3 weeks after his rescue, Titan was strong enough to take his first proper walk outside. The staff lined the clinic's small garden path, watching as he took tentative steps into the sunlight. Annie walked beside him, ready to support him if his strength failed, but Titan moved forward steadily, his nose lifted to catch the breeze, his ears perked with interest at every new sound. Annie noticed something profound during these initial walks. Titan never pulled at his leash. After years of being chained, he seemed to understand that this tether was different. It was a connection, not a constraint. He would frequently look back at Annie, as if checking that she was still there, that this new freedom was real and not just another dream in his basement prison. The transformation in Titan's spirit matched his physical recovery. As his body grew stronger, his personality began to emerge. Staff discovered he had a gentle, playful side, particularly with children who visited the clinic. He would lie patiently as toddlers stroked his now growing fur, somehow knowing to stay still even when small hands weren't as gentle as they could be. 1 month into his recovery, Dr. Chen gathered the team to discuss Titan's future. His medical needs had stabilized enough that he could be discharged to a home environment. The discussion was interrupted by Titan himself, who had managed to walk from his bed to the conference room, drawn by the sound of familiar voices. He settled himself next to Annie's chair with a quiet determination that seemed to say he had already chosen his path forward. The decision to adopt Titan wasn't really a decision at all for Annie. It felt more like accepting something that had been destined since the moment she found him in that basement. Her small apartment would need adjustments. Her photography schedule would have to become more flexible, but there was no question in her mind that Titan was meant to be part of her life. Bringing him home for the first time was a moment of mixed emotions. Titan, now strong enough to walk confidently on his own, stepped carefully into the apartment, his nose working overtime to process the new environment. He moved from room to room with deliberate care, not fearful but methodical, as if mapping an escape route, a habit from his past that might never fully fade. Annie's daughter, Sophie, had been prepared for Titan's arrival through video calls and visits to the clinic, but meeting him at home was different. The 7-year-old sat quietly on the floor, waiting for Titan to approach her. When he finally did, laying his head gently in her lap, Sophie whispered, "He feels safe now, Mommy." The simple observation brought tears to Annie's eyes. The physical transformation in Titan over the next few months was remarkable. His once skeletal frame filled out with healthy muscle, his coat grew thick and glossy, and his eyes sparkled with life. But it was the emotional transformation that truly amazed everyone who knew his story. The dog, who had every reason to mistrust humans, became an ambassador of forgiveness and love. Titan's gentle nature with children caught the attention of a local therapy dog training program. Despite his traumatic past, or perhaps because of it, he showed an incredible intuition for people in pain. The trainers were initially cautious, given his history, but Titan passed every evaluation with extraordinary patience and sensitivity. His first official therapy visit was to the children's ward of the same hospital whose emergency vet clinic had saved his life. Titan seemed to know instinctively which children needed him most, spending extra time with those who were scared or in pain.